How does a man prepare to rule the world while training himself to need nothing from it? How does someone step toward absolute power and at the same time step away from everything that power can offer? Before he became emperor, before the wars and the decisions that would stretch across continents, Marcus Aurelius existed in a quieter form, not as a ruler, but as a mind being shaped. He was born in 121 CE in the city of Rome. At that time, Rome was not uncertain about its position in the world. It was the center of a vast empire. Its authority extended across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Its systems were stable, its structure was tested, its power was not questioned from within. This stability matters, because it created an environment where pressure did not appear as chaos. It appeared as expectation. Marcus was born into a family already close to that expectation. His father came from a respected lineage. His grandfather held influence in the Senate. His household was not distant from power. It was part of the network that supported it. From the beginning, his life was not open in every direction. It was guided, not forcefully, but precisely. As a child, Marcus did not stand out through dominance or ambition. There are no early records of him seeking attention or control. What appears instead is restraint. He was quiet, measured, more controlled than those around him. This difference did not remain private. It was observed. The emperor at the time, Hadrian, noticed him. Hadrian was not only a ruler, he was also a planner. He understood that the stability of Rome depended not only on armies and laws, but on succession. Who would come next? And how they would carry the system forward. Hadrian gave Marcus a name that would follow him: Verissimus, the most truthful one. This was not a compliment in the modern sense. It was a classification. In Rome, truth was not about honesty alone. It was about consistency, about remaining stable under pressure, about not shifting when conditions became difficult. Even as a child, Marcus was being measured against something he had not yet experienced: power. At this stage, he was still outside it. His life moved through education, routine, and observation. He was surrounded by wealth, but not defined by it. His environment allowed comfort, but did not require indulgence. This distinction would become important, because Marcus did not move toward what was available to him. He moved away from it. As he grew, his education expanded. He studied rhetoric, law, and literature as expected for someone of his position. But one area began to take deeper hold: philosophy. He was introduced to Stoicism, a system of thought that did not focus on external success, but on internal order. It taught that events outside the mind cannot be fully controlled. Only response can. It emphasized discipline, clarity, reduction of unnecessary desire. For most, these ideas remain theoretical. For Marcus, they became practical. He began to apply them to his daily life. He simplified his habits. He reduced comfort where possible. He practiced endurance, not as performance, but as training. There are accounts of him choosing to sleep on the floor, even when he did not have to. This was not rejection of his environment. It was preparation for something beyond it. At the same time, Rome continued to operate in its structured calm. The empire was ruled by Antoninus Pius, a man known for stability and restraint. His reign was not marked by dramatic expansion or visible crisis. It was defined by continuity. This continuity shaped Marcus. It showed him that power did not always need to appear forceful. It could exist quietly, through maintenance, through consistency. But beneath this calm, the structure of succession was already in motion. Hadrian had made a decision before his death. He selected Antoninus Pius as his successor, but with a condition. Antoninus would adopt two heirs, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. This moment changed everything. Adoption in Rome was not personal. It was structural. It meant that Marcus was no longer simply part of a noble family. He became part of the imperial line. His future was no longer open. It was assigned. From that point forward, every part of his life carried a different weight. His actions were no longer private. They were signals. His education was no longer general. It was specific, directed toward governance, toward responsibility, toward a role that would not allow withdrawal. Marcus entered the household of Antoninus Pius. This environment was more controlled than anything he had known before. Every interaction carried meaning. Every decision, even small ones, was observed. He was not only being taught, he was being evaluated. At the same time, his philosophical training deepened. Stoicism was no longer a subject. It became a method of alignment. He practiced separating what he could control from what he could not. He practiced observing his thoughts before acting on them. He practiced reducing emotional reaction. This created a stable internal structure, but it also introduced a quiet contradiction. The role he was preparing for required engagement with the external world at the highest level. Politics, war, administration, human behavior on a massive scale. These are not controlled environments. They are unpredictable. They require response, not detachment. Stoicism teaches distance. Power requires involvement. Marcus began to carry both directions at once. Externally, he moved closer to authority. Internally, he moved away from attachment to it. At first, this did not create visible tension. It appeared as discipline, as maturity, as strength of character. He fulfilled expectations. He took on responsibilities gradually, legal duties, administrative roles, public appearances. He learned how decisions were made, how information moved, how authority was maintained. But as his role expanded, so did the complexity of what he observed. He saw that control at the highest level was incomplete. Decisions did not guarantee outcomes. Plans did not eliminate uncertainty. The empire functioned not because everything was controlled, but because instability was constantly managed. This realization did not disrupt him. It reinforced his philosophy. If the external world cannot be fully controlled, then internal control becomes essential. But this creates pressure, because the emperor cannot remain internal. He must act. He must decide. He must engage with outcomes that cannot be predicted. Marcus continued to refine his internal discipline. He developed routines, waking early, reflecting on his actions, reviewing where he had acted in alignment with reason and where he had not. These practices created consistency, but they also revealed something. Control is not permanent. It must be maintained. Each day requires the same effort, the same attention. There is no final state of stability, only repetition. At the same time, the perception of him began to change. He was no longer just a student. He was the future. Others adjusted their behavior around him. Interactions became more formal, more cautious, more calculated. He existed within expectation, not as a possibility, as a certainty. This changed the structure of his environment. Nothing was neutral. Everything carried meaning, even silence. At this stage, Marcus stood at the threshold of power. Not yet emperor, but no longer separate from the role. He had built an internal system designed to remain stable under pressure. But the scale of that pressure had not yet arrived. And this is where the first real tension appears. Not in events, in direction. He was moving toward a position that would require constant engagement with a world he had trained himself not to depend on. A role defined by control, held by a mind trained in detachment. The two structures did not conflict openly. They coexisted, quietly, but the distance between them was already present, and it would not remain stable forever. Marcus Aurelius did not take power in a moment of chaos. He entered it through continuity. In 161 CE, Antoninus Pius died after a long and stable reign. The transition that followed was quiet. There was no rupture in the system, no visible struggle for control. Authority moved as it had been designed to move. Marcus Aurelius became emperor, but he did not step into the role alone. Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, was raised to equal status. This decision was deliberate. It reflected an understanding that the empire had grown beyond the capacity of a single center. Power was now shared. On the surface, this created balance. Marcus remained in Rome. He managed administration, law, and the internal structure of governance. Lucius moved east, toward the frontier, where military pressure was increasing. The division was practical. It was also fragile. Marcus approached power with the same internal discipline he had developed earlier. He did not change his habits dramatically. He maintained simplicity. He avoided excess. He focused on duty rather than display. This gave his rule a certain clarity. He did not attempt to redefine the system. He worked within it. At the same time, his position required constant engagement. Petitions arrived daily. Legal cases required judgment. Provincial issues demanded attention. Decisions moved through layers of administration that depended on his final authority. He became the central point through which the empire organized itself. This required presence, not only physical, but mental. He could not withdraw. Even as he maintained internal distance, his role demanded continuous interaction with external conditions. In the east, Lucius Verus led the campaign against Parthia. The conflict developed gradually. It was not immediate or decisive. Roman forces advanced, but not without resistance. Cities were taken. Territory shifted. The process unfolded over years. Marcus did not direct the war from the battlefield. He directed the system that supported it. Supplies, reinforcements, logistics, and political stability in Rome itself. His responsibility was not limited to strategy. It extended to maintaining the structure that allowed strategy to function. This required coordination at scale. He relied on advisors, experienced administrators, military leaders, legal experts. Their role was to extend his capacity. But reliance introduces another layer: trust. He had to accept information that he could not verify directly. He had to make decisions based on reports filtered through distance. This created a form of indirect control. He acted on knowledge that was always incomplete. The war eventually turned in Rome's favor. Parthian resistance weakened. Roman forces secured victory. The outcome reinforced the image of imperial strength. But the consequences did not end with victory. As soldiers returned from the east, something else returned with them: illness. At first, it appeared as isolated cases: a soldier falling sick, a small group affected, conditions that could be explained by fatigue or environment. But the pattern expanded. The illness spread beyond the army. It reached cities. It moved through trade routes. It appeared in regions far from the original conflict. What became known as the Antonine Plague began to reshape the empire. Marcus received reports that did not stabilize. Numbers increased. Locations multiplied. Descriptions repeated with slight variation. Fever, weakness, death. The system continued to function. but it was now carrying a condition it could not control. Marcus responded through structure. He organized resources. He adjusted burial practices. He redirected support to affected areas. He did not attempt to explain the disease in philosophical terms. He treated it as a practical problem. But practical response has limits when cause is unknown. The plague reduced population. It weakened the army. It disrupted agriculture. It altered economic patterns. It also changed perception. Fear moved through the population, not in a single wave, but gradually. Markets shifted. Public gatherings declined. Trust in stability weakened. Marcus remained steady. He continued to govern. But the nature of governance had changed. It was no longer about maintaining order. It was about managing disruption. At the same time, his relationship with Lucius Verus came to an end. Lucius died, likely from the same illness that had spread through the empire. His death removed the balance of shared rule. Marcus became sole emperor. This increased his authority. It also concentrated pressure. All decisions now moved through a single point. There was no division, no secondary center. The system depended entirely on his capacity to maintain it. He did not retreat from this. He absorbed it. Soon after, another layer of instability emerged. Along the northern frontier, beyond the Danube, tribal groups began to move. These movements were not coordinated as a single invasion. They were gradual. Groups crossing borders, testing defenses, searching for opportunity. Over time, this became the Marcomannic Wars. Marcus made a decision that shifted his position again. He left Rome. This was not symbolic. It was necessary. He moved to the frontier and established command from within the military environment. This changed the structure of his rule. He was no longer separated from conflict by distance. He was inside it. Daily life changed. He lived in camps. He worked within the rhythm of military operations. Reports arrived continuously. Decisions were immediate. The distance between cause and effect shortened. At the same time, the plague did not disappear. It followed the army. It reduced strength. It created uncertainty within already unstable conditions. Marcus was now managing multiple layers of pressure. External threat, internal disease, administrative continuity. Each required attention. None could be fully controlled. This is where psychological depth increases. He continued to apply Stoic principles. Control what can be controlled, accept what cannot. Act with reason. But the environment did not allow for clear boundaries. Almost everything required action. Almost nothing guaranteed outcome. This creates a narrowing of internal space. The mind reduces complexity to maintain function. Marcus began to write more frequently. Short reflections, direct statements. They would later be known as meditations. These writings were not composed for others. They were tools. Each entry functioned as a return to structure, a way to maintain clarity under pressure. At the same time, relationships around him became more complex. He depended on generals to carry out campaigns. He depended on administrators to maintain order in Rome. He depended on advisors to interpret information. Trust remained necessary, but the system had already shown that it could fracture. Avidius Cassius, a respected general, declared himself emperor in the East. This was not an external enemy. It was internal, a response to uncertainty, a miscalculation based on false information that Marcus had died. But the act itself revealed something. Loyalty was not absolute. It could shift under pressure. Marcus prepared for confrontation. But the situation resolved before escalation. Cassius was killed by his own men. The rebellion ended quickly. Marcus responded with restraint. He did not pursue widespread punishment. He maintained stability. But the knowledge remained. The system was not fixed. It required continuous alignment. At this stage, the empire still functioned. Its borders held. Its administration operated. Its army remained active. But the conditions under which it functioned had changed. Everything required more effort, more coordination, more attention. Marcus continued to operate within this structure. He did not seek dramatic solutions. He maintained process. But internally, something was shifting. The expectation of resolution began to weaken. Problems did not end. They transformed. Each solution created new conditions. Each adjustment led to further adjustment. This created a continuous loop. The mind adapts to this by changing expectation, not seeking completion, maintaining continuity. Marcus Aurelius remained stable, but stability now meant something different. Not balance, endurance. A system held together not by absence of pressure, but by constant response to it. The moment does not begin with a crisis. It begins with a decision that appears ordinary. A decision about succession. For years, Marcus Aurelius had governed under continuous pressure. War along the Danube, the lasting effects of the Antonine Plague, administrative strain across distant provinces, internal instability that had already revealed itself once through rebellion. None of these conditions had fully resolved. They had only been managed. By the later years of his reign, Marcus understood something clearly. The empire would not return to a stable equilibrium. It would continue through adjustment. This understanding changes how decisions are made. Short-term solutions are no longer enough. Continuity becomes the central concern. And continuity requires succession. Rome had developed a method for this. For several generations, emperors had not relied on biological inheritance. They selected successors based on perceived capability. Adoption was used as a tool to maintain stability. This system had worked. It reduced uncertainty. It placed power in hands that had been prepared. Marcus himself was a result of this structure. He had been chosen, not born into the role. This is the context in which the decision takes shape. His son, Commodus, had been present within the imperial system for years. He had grown up inside the environment of power. He had observed its structure. He had been exposed to its expectations. But exposure is not the same as preparation. Marcus understood the difference. He had spent his life training his mind to operate under pressure, to separate judgment from reaction, to maintain internal order when external order failed. This training had taken years. It had required discipline. It had required repetition. It had required continuous correction. There is no evidence that Commodus underwent the same process with the same intensity. This creates the condition for conflict. Not external, internal. Marcus stands at a point where two structures meet. One is philosophical. The Stoic framework he has relied on throughout his life. It emphasizes reason, clarity, detachment from personal attachment. The other is structural, the reality of imperial continuity, the need to present a clear line of succession, to avoid uncertainty, to prevent fragmentation after his death. These two structures do not fully align. One prioritizes rational selection. The other allows for inheritance. The decision forms slowly. It is not made in a single moment. It develops through conditions. Years of pressure, years of managing instability, years of maintaining a system that no longer stabilizes itself. Within this environment, continuity becomes more valuable than optimization. A stable transfer of power may matter more than the ideal choice of successor. Marcus elevates Commodus, first as Caesar, then as co-emperor. This formalizes the decision. It is no longer a possibility. It becomes structure. The act itself is simple, a declaration, a recognition, an adjustment of titles. But its implications are extensive. From that moment, the system begins to orient around Commodus as future ruler. Administrators adjust their expectations. Military leaders recalibrate their loyalty. The Senate acknowledges the transition. The empire, as a structure, begins to move toward its next phase. This is what makes the decision irreversible. It is not only personal, it is systemic. Once declared, it cannot be withdrawn without creating instability. To reverse it would signal uncertainty at the highest level. It would introduce doubt. It would weaken the very continuity the decision was meant to secure. Marcus understands this. He has spent years observing how fragile alignment can be, how quickly confidence can shift, how easily internal structures can fracture under uncertainty. The memory of Avidius Cassius declaring himself emperor still exists within this context. A single moment of perceived weakness had been enough to trigger rebellion. This informs the decision. Stability must be visible. Continuity must be clear, even if the internal logic is not perfect. This is where the psychological tension becomes most precise. Marcus has spent his life training himself to act according to reason, to avoid attachment, to evaluate situations without being influenced by emotion. But this decision cannot be isolated from personal dimension. Commodus is not only a potential successor, he is his son. The Stoic framework does not remove relationships. It regulates response to them. But regulation does not eliminate influence. The decision exists at the intersection of principle and proximity. Marcus does not leave a direct explanation of his reasoning. He does not justify the choice in his writings, but the absence of explanation does not remove the presence of conflict. Instead, it shifts it inward. The act of writing continues during this period. Short reflections, focused statements, reminders of principles, return to reason, acceptance of what cannot be controlled. These entries maintain the same tone, but their context has changed. They are no longer only responses to external instability. They exist alongside a decision that cannot be adjusted. This creates a different kind of pressure. Not ongoing, fixed, a point that cannot be moved. The mind must now align with something it has already set in motion. This is different from managing external events. External events can be accepted as they occur. A decision of this scale must be integrated. It must be carried forward. Marcus continues to operate as emperor. He continues to manage campaigns. He continues to oversee administration. Externally, nothing changes. The system remains functional. But internally, the structure has shifted. There is now a defined future. And that future is no longer open to adjustment. This is the break, not a collapse, not a visible failure. A moment where the alignment between philosophy and action is tested in a way that cannot be resolved through repetition. Stoicism provides tools for dealing with what happens. It does not remove the weight of what has been chosen. Marcus does not reverse the decision. He does not attempt to alter the structure. He continues forward. The empire continues with him. But the direction has been set, and it cannot be undone. Marcus Aurelius did not live long enough to see the full shape of what he had set in motion. The decision regarding succession had already been absorbed into the structure of the empire. Commodus had been elevated step by step until the transition became a matter of form rather than question. When Marcus died in 180 CE, there was no disruption in procedure. The empire did not pause. It transferred. The military accepted the new authority. The Senate performed its role. The administrative system adjusted without structural collapse. In that sense, the mechanism worked exactly as it had been designed to work. Continuity held, but continuity is not the same as stability in quality. It is only stability in motion. What followed was not immediate breakdown, but gradual transformation of direction. The system continued, but under different weight distribution. The center of gravity shifted. This shift is where consequences begin to appear. Marcus had governed through a long period of overlapping pressures. War along the Danube, internal strain after the Antonine Plague, rebellion that had tested internal loyalty, years of adjustment without final resolution. His method had been endurance, not resolution. Control through continuous correction. The empire he left behind inherited that structure, but not the internal discipline that had sustained it. This difference is not visible at first. It emerges slowly in administration, in military command, in the relationship between authority and execution. The system remains intact, but the alignment weakens. Historically, this period becomes a transition point. Later accounts describe increasing instability, but from the perspective of the moment, it was not collapse. It was drift. Marcus Aurelius himself did not leave behind a political doctrine. He did not formalize his governance into a system that could be replicated. What remains is personal writing, fragmented reflection, internal discipline recorded in language rather than institution. Meditations is not a manual of rule, it is a record of maintenance. A mind repeatedly returning to equilibrium under pressure that does not end. This is part of the contradiction that defines his legacy. Externally, he held absolute authority. Internally, he trained himself to detach from authority. Externally, he governed a vast and complex empire. Internally, he reduced experience to principles of acceptance and control. These two movements never fully merged. They coexisted. The consequences of this coexistence are not immediate. They appear in the structure that follows him. Commodus's rule reflects a shift in tone, but more importantly, a shift in internal coherence. The selection that had once been designed as a stabilizing mechanism becomes, over time, a point of divergence from earlier practices, not because of a single action, but because the system no longer contains the same filtering process it once did. Marcus's own life ends before this becomes fully visible. He dies near the frontier, in the same environment where much of his later reign had unfolded. There is no retreat into symbolic space, no separation between ruler and condition. The position ends within the environment that defined it. What remains is the system, and the memory of how it was held together. The psychological state of Marcus in his final period cannot be separated from function. He does not appear to abandon his principles. He continues to apply them. Acceptance, clarity, separation between what can and cannot be controlled. But repetition at this stage is no longer only discipline. It becomes continuity under saturation. A structure maintained without expectation of relief. This is not collapse. It is sustained alignment under permanent pressure. The contradiction, then, is not resolved. It is carried. Marcus Aurelius exists at the intersection of two forces that never fully merge. A philosophy that seeks inner independence, and a role that demands absolute external responsibility. He does not escape either. He inhabits both until the end. After him, the empire continues. It changes shape. It adjusts. It persists. But the method of holding it together is no longer the same. What remains in his writing is not instruction for rule. It is evidence of how one mind tried to remain coherent inside conditions that did not stabilize. A continuous return to order within a world that does not remain ordered. And in that return, there is no final conclusion. Only the trace of repetition, a pattern of thought that circles the same principles under changing pressure, as if stability is not a state to reach, but something to maintain moment by moment as long as it is required, and then released without announcement when it is no longer needed.